Pam Bondi demands answers from Stacey Abrams over missing $2 billion, Congress in shock. Washington, D.C., April 10, 2025. The Capitol dome stood against a gray morning sky, cloaked in tension as the House Oversight Committee convened a hearing that had been quietly building for months. Former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi, flanked by a binder thick with IRS documents and internal communications, sat poised to address the nation. At the center of the unfolding controversy, a staggering $2 billion federal grant issued by the Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) in 2024 to a little-known nonprofit coalition, Power Forward Communities, of which Stacey Abrams' group, Rewiring America, was a founding member. What drew Bondi's legal fire wasn't just the amount, but the circumstances. "We have two organizations," she began, one with no measurable operational history, the other with only $100 in bank holdings, and we're expected to believe they were equipped to handle $2 billion in public funds. Within 21 days, Bondi's words were deliberate, restrained, but piercing. The room, usually indifferent during such sessions, listened in silence. Cameras clicked. C-SPAN rolled live. Behind her, political strategist and media, surrogate Caroline Leavitt, coordinated digital briefings, while Tesla CEO Elon Musk's audit team prepared a ledger of what they called fiscal absurdities, uncovered in the grant's downstream allocations: $7. $9 million to Sri Lanka for gendered language training, $1.5 million to rebuild Cuba's media ecosystem, $8.3 million toward equity education in Nepal. These were just the warm-up acts. Bondi turned a page and looked directly toward the EPA's designated representative. "Administrator Zeldin, did your agency mandate that these funds be distributed in 21 days, yet only require that the grantees learn how to create a budget within 99 A stunned silence followed, a few gasps, and then murmurs of disbelief among committee members on both sides of the aisle. This wasn't political theater anymore. It was beginning to smell like a cover-up, but Bondi wasn't done. Her next target? The paperwork trail that didn't match the rhetoric. A grant application that, according to IRS filings, described Rewiring America's year of receipt as its startup year with no declared accomplishments. So we gave them a check for $490 million to see if they could figure it out later. The gavel dropped. The hearing was now officially in session. The fluorescent lighting above the Capitol hearing chamber flickered slightly, as if registering the tension seated below. Pam Bondi, composed but unmistakably locked in, raised a printed copy of IRS Form 990 for all to see. The document, dry and technical in appearance, would turn out to be anything but. "This," Bondi said, "is the only filing submitted by Rewiring America to the IRS before they received nearly $500 million in taxpayer funds." Silence. The form listed the organization's accomplishments for 2023, the same year the grant was issued. Under Summary of Activities, there was a single line: joined a coalition of national organizations to apply for a grant from the Inflation Reduction Act's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. No implementation reports, no historical financials, no personnel structure, no operational plan. "And this," Bondi continued, flipping to a separate document, "is the grant disbursement schedule, showing that Rewiring America's coalition was given $2 billion from the EPA to be spent in full within 21 days. To her left, Caroline Leavitt leaned into her microphone and transmitted the data across social media in real time. Hashtags trended within minutes. Hashtag 2BillionBlind, hashtag AbramsMoneyGate, hashtag EPA at 21 days. Across the aisle, eyebrows arched, even among some Democrats who now realized the level of due diligence negligence might be too public to ignore. Bondi addressed EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin, seated under oath. "Mr. Zeldin, let's be clear. Your agency approved this grant 6 months after the coalition formed. One of the members had $100 in revenue, another had no prior federal contract experience, and yet they were entrusted with more money than the annual budget of your own agency's research division. How is that justified?" Zeldin shifted in his seat. His notes lay untouched in front of him. He inhaled and exhaled slowly. "Congresswoman, the coalition demonstrated alignment with the administration's energy priorities. They expressed commitment to housing equity and, spare us the language, Bondi snapped. They submitted a grant pitch, not a business plan. They offered promises, not protocols. You fast-tracked billions to them while requiring them to take a course within 90 days on how to develop a budget. Someone coughed from the back of the chamber. A representative from Georgia adjusted her earpiece. 2 seats over, a staffer sent a message to their chief of staff with a single word, disaster. Bondi pressed forward. The act that fueled it all, the funding, she reminded the chamber, originated from the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, a sweeping $1.2 trillion package passed without a single Republican vote. The legislation, hailed by the Biden administration as a solution to combat inflation and advance green initiatives, had become increasingly opaque in how its funds were deployed. It was passed as an anti-inflation measure, Bondi said, but even President Biden himself admitted later that it did nothing to reduce prices. Levitt chimed in via statement from her digital console. What families got were $890 extra monthly expenses, soaring utility bills, and a bill called inflation relief that turned out to be a Trojan horse for party-aligned NGOs. The American people got conned. Across the room, pamphlets from the EPA laid on a side table, their covers emblazoned with cheerful phrases like greener homes, stronger communities, and empowering change with equity. But within the documents, buried between line items, the Bondi team had discovered a stunning revelation. The flow of funds, spending porn, defined Bondi, turned to the whiteboard behind her. Let's trace where the money went. Lines were drawn, names appeared, dollar signs followed. $7.9 million. Training Sri Lankan journalists. On non-binary language, $2. $1 million. Paid to the BBC to strengthen media ecosystems in Libya, $1.5 million. Rebuilding Cuba's digital media landscape, $8. $3 million. Equity and inclusion curriculum development for Nepal. This is what we call spending porn, Bondi declared. Grand words, feel-good phrases, 0 measurable outcomes. And it's being funded while American veterans can't afford heating bills. Caroline Levitt nodded as she handed out copies of internal memos uncovered during an FOIA request. One memo, dated October 2023, confirmed that Power Forward Communities, the coalition created by Rewiring America and other nonprofits, had submitted an initial operating budget after the grant had been awarded. They didn't even know what they were going to do with the money, but the check had already cleared. The Abrams connection, at the heart of it all, stood Stacey Abrams, former gubernatorial candidate of Georgia, now senior counsel at Rewiring America. She had been announced as a leadership figure in early 2023, around the time the coalition formed, and before any operations were underway. Bondi, cautious not to personalize the issue, quoted directly from Abrams' public remarks on MSNBC and during her 2022 debates. In her words, attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion are attacks on democracy. In another, she referred to fetal heartbeats as a manufactured sound. Bondi paused. She is entitled to her opinions. That is the American way. But she is not entitled to billions in taxpayer funds without oversight, accountability, or performance. The unanswered bids. As the committee reviewed the EPA's documentation, another troubling fact emerged. No record existed of competing bids or a transparent selection process. There was no evidence of a merit-based decision. Qualified organizations with multi-year histories of energy transition work were left out entirely. What this looks like, Bondi said, is a closed-door deal, greenlit by political alignment rather than merit. The public deserves to know why every other applicant was excluded. Zeldin sat motionless. The storm ahead, the hearing was only halfway through. Whispers now echoed louder, questions stacked atop each other, and reporters scurried outside the chamber to prepare their midday reports. This isn't over, Caroline Levitt said, as she closed her laptop. It's barely begun. As Bondi gathered her papers, one thing became clear. The walls of this narrative weren't built from solid facts. They were built from paper, thin and flammable. And they were starting to burn. 48 hours after the congressional hearing ended, the fog in Washington hadn't lifted. It had thickened. The video of Pam Bondi's cross-examination had gone viral across conservative platforms, with clips racking up millions of views in hours. She had pierced the bureaucracy with surgical precision, cornering EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin with the precision of a former prosecutor who knew exactly where the paper trail led and where it disappeared. But in politics, truth never travels alone. It is immediately trailed by spin. The first line of defense. By Friday morning, media outlets began to pick sides. Mainstream editorial boards called the accusations politically motivated, suggesting that Bondi's inquiry was more about undermining the Inflation Reduction Act than uncovering malfeasance. One op-ed from a major daily went as far as to frame the probe as an attack on climate justice. Bondi is trying to weaponize procedural gaps to sabotage environmental equity initiatives. The piece read, "She fails to recognize that innovation often begins before formal operations take shape." Caroline Levitt, in response, didn't hesitate. If innovation begins with zero assets, zero staff, and a $2 billion check, she told Fox Business, then I've got a lemonade stand that deserves a NASA contract. On her end, Stacey Abrams remained conspicuously silent. No press conference, no rebuttal op-ed, no statement. Her legal team, however, requested a delay on the IRS's follow-up audit into Rewiring America's 2023 activities, citing pending clarification of records. That clarification never came. The second, inside the emails, back on Capitol Hill, Bondi's office had received a trove of internal communications from an EPA whistleblower. The anonymous source provided a series of emails dated between June and October 2023, showing early correspondence between power-forward communities and senior officials inside the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund unit. The subject lines were, at best, uncomfortable. At worst, damning. Subject, expedite pipeline, priority group list subject, rewiring coalition, White House interest subject, budget submission template, optional, subject, urgent, public narrative coordination. Attached to several of these threads were talking points drafted by external consultants, indicating that members of the EPA and power-forward communities were already preparing joint statements months before the grant was officially awarded. There were no competing applicants, Bondi told the Wall Street Journal. There was no competition at all. It was an anointment, dressed up as a process. The third, the donor loop digging further, Bondi's team began tracing financial links between Rewiring America board members and high-dollar Democratic donors. Caroline Levitt's communications team published an expose detailing how multiple coalition advisors had either bundled donations or directly served as finance chairs for PACs aligned with the Biden campaign. The most notable connection? A former Obama-era Department of Energy appointee, now listed as senior project architect for Power Forward, had hosted a private fundraiser in 2022 with a ticket price of $50,000 per plate, just 4 months before the coalition's formation. Bondi made no direct accusation of quid pro quo, but the optics were radioactive. Public money, she said in a televised statement, should serve the public, not complete the circuit between campaign bundlers and sweetheart grants. The fourth, strategic distancing within the EPA. Murmurs of unease had begun. Administrator Zeldin, once proud of the coalition's approval, now distanced himself in internal memos. An unsigned memo leaked from the EPA's Office of Compliance bore the header, Review of Grant Oversight Procedures, GGRF Cycle, Flight 2024. The memo proposed an internal audit to assess vetting procedures retroactively for organizations deemed emergent or development stage. Translation, they were preparing to clean house, or at least look like it. Meanwhile, several House Democrats who originally supported the act began issuing their own careful statements, distancing themselves from the Power Forward grant specifically, while reaffirming support for the Inflation Reduction Act in general. Every federal program deserves appropriate oversight. One congresswoman stated, without mentioning Abrams' name once. The temperature was rising. A scandal takes form. What began as a procedural review had become something more, something resembling a full-blown scandal. Bondi's team labeled it Equitygate. Conservative media outlets adopted it immediately. CNN and MSNBC began running defensive panels, focusing on Bondi's political affiliations and past ties to Trump's legal team, attempting to reframe the issue as partisan maneuvering. But the facts were increasingly difficult to refute. The coalition's IRS filings were verifiably empty of substantive accomplishments. Their revenue was negligible before receiving the grant. The EPA's own communications revealed White House involvement before formal vetting. And perhaps most jarring, the organizations were given 21 days to spend $2 billion and 90 days to take a course on how to build a budget. If you gave this much money to a toddler and asked them to build a rocket, Levitt quipped on Newsmax, you'd at least want proof they knew what a screwdriver was. Bondi didn't laugh. This isn't funny, she said soberly. It's a betrayal. VITH the veterans and the voters. A day later, Bondi received an email from a retired Army sergeant in Mississippi. He wrote, "I've been waiting 6 months for my VA roof assistance paperwork to be processed. They told me funding was tight, but they had $2 billion for brand new nonprofits run by lobbyists." Bondi read it aloud during an appearance on Capitol Hill. The room fell silent. And in that silence, the next phase was already forming, a call for criminal investigation. If the EPA had ignored proper bidding protocols, and if political relationships had influenced the grant's approval, then someone, somewhere, had knowingly bypassed legal oversight. Bondi's office was drafting a formal criminal referral to the DOJ's Inspector General. Levitt coordinated media briefings and legal support as the narrative hardened into something undeniable. There was smoke, and now the public began to believe maybe there really was fire. The air in Washington had shifted. It no longer hummed with quiet deflection. It buzzed with the threat of exposure. In the days following Pam Bondi's formal announcement of a criminal referral to the Department of Justice's Inspector General, the entire political climate turned volatile. This wasn't just a procedural investigation anymore. It was quickly becoming the kind of systemic failure that threatens careers, derails agendas, and breaks public trust. Bondi knew the path she was on would trigger institutional resistance, but what she didn't anticipate was how quickly the rot would begin to show, and how many voices from inside the government would start speaking out. On April 24th, a staffer from the EPA's Grants and Compliance Division stepped forward. Their identity was kept confidential under whistleblower protection statutes, but the details they provided were precise. According to the staffer, the grant to power-forward communities bypassed normal scoring procedures typically applied to federal funding cycles. The usual review process, an interagency panel that grades applications based on merit, history, and capacity, had been reduced to a single internal recommendation memo, allegedly authored under pressure from senior-level White House liaisons. One excerpt from the whistleblower's affidavit was particularly damning. We were told, "This one's greenlit from upstairs. Don't bottleneck it." That's a direct quote from my supervisor. The scoring matrix was skipped entirely. That affidavit, entered into the record by Bondi's office, was sent simultaneously to the DOJ Inspector General, the House Committee on Oversight, and the Senate Subcommittee on Government Operations. Within hours, 2 more staffers came forward, anonymously confirming the grant had been pre-selected and that objections within the EPA were brushed off for political optics. The system hadn't failed. It had been intentionally bypassed. The White House press secretary, in a tightly worded briefing, issued a defensive but non-committal statement. The administration stands by the principles of the Inflation Reduction Act and the oversight mechanisms it includes. Any suggestion of wrongdoing should be addressed through appropriate legal channels, which the administration fully respects. Notably, the statement made no mention of Pam Bondi, Power Forward, or Stacey Abrams by name. Caroline Levitt, speaking on behalf of Bondi's investigative team, called it a tepid dodge wrapped in legalese. They can't say her name, Levitt told News Nation, because if they do, they'll be forced to answer the follow-up question, why did her organization get $2 billion, with $100 in the bank and no track record, while veterans and working-class Americans are told to wait their turn? Pressure began mounting on Administrator Lee Zeldin, who remained conspicuously absent from public view for nearly a week. Inside the EPA, internal emails leaked to Bondi's team revealed frantic coordination over recovery language, narrative alignment, and retroactive vetting justification. In short, they were scrambling to rewrite history. By May honest, Bondi had secured bipartisan support to convene a special oversight review panel, pulling in members from both the House Oversight Committee and the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Energy and Environment. This wasn't a witch hunt. It was shaping up to be a congressional reckoning. Even moderate Democrats, some of whom had supported the original legislation, began to distance themselves. Quiet meetings were held. Talking points revised. Private polling began to show that voters across ideological lines were deeply disturbed by what they saw. A $2 billion grant to brand new nonprofits with political affiliations, no track record, no competitive bidding, and a 21-day spending mandate. Meanwhile, public pressure mounted online. A petition demanding full DOJ investigation into rewiring America and Power Forward surged past 1.3 million signatures. The tagline, $100 in the bank, $2 billion from the taxpayers. Demand justice. On May 3rd, Bondi submitted a follow-up letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland requesting a criminal inquiry into the possible misuse of federal funds, citing the Whistleblower Protection Act, the Federal Grants and Cooperative Agreements Act, and the Anti-Deficiency Act. The letter named Stacey Abrams, Senior Counsel of Rewiring America, Tim Myopoulos, lead executive of Power Forward senior EPA staff involved in the grant cycle, any White House official who communicated directives to bypass scoring protocols. Bondi's language was clear. This referral does not seek political victory. It seeks the restoration of public trust and the enforcement of federal law. We do not criminalize policy differences, but we must criminalize coordinated circumvention of oversight. The Department of Justice acknowledged receipt, but no comment was issued. For now, as the story reached critical mass, Bondi's team released a comprehensive timeline and visual report documenting the grant's trajectory. It was clean, visual, undeniable. In a matter of days, cable news networks began using the term Abrams grant scandal. Foreign press, notably The Times and Der Spiegel, ran pieces on U.S. fiscal mismanagement. Polling from Pew showed 76% of Americans supported a DOJ probe, including 59% of registered Democrats. Even Abrams' strongest allies in progressive media went quiet. What began as a probe into an over-budget energy fund had become a story of institutional decay, partisan shielding, and a political establishment protecting its own. And it was about to get worse. In early May, Levitt received a tip from a journalist with long-standing sources inside federal law enforcement. There were unconfirmed reports, still off the record, that a parallel investigation inside the DOJ had already begun under sealed subpoena, and that certain communications between Power Forward executives and political staffers had been flagged for irregular coordination. The word wiretap surfaced. Bondi didn't comment. But her team did one thing that made DC sit up and pay attention. They booked a second hearing. Date May 12th, 2025. Title, Oversight Hearing, Misuse of Climate Grants and Bypassing Federal Grant Protocols. Witness list, expanded. Subpoenas pending. And in bold lettering beneath the title, Stacey Abrams, invited to testify. Capitol Hill, May 12, 2025, 9:00 a.m. The hearing chamber was standing room only. Staffers, journalists, aides, and congressional members from both parties sat in tense silence, the kind of silence that precedes either a storm or a reckoning. Pam Bondi, now in command of a bipartisan coalition of House oversight members, stood at the dais. Her tone was measured, her evidence airtight, her intention unmistakable. Before her, a seat reserved for Stacey Abrams sat vacant. The invitation to testify had been sent, confirmed, and, at the last moment, declined. Abrams' legal counsel had issued a letter asserting she would not participate in a political circus, citing ongoing investigations and an environment unsuitable for factual inquiry. Bondi held up the letter for the record. Let the record reflect that Miss Abrams has declined to appear before this body, despite public funds of over $2 billion being allocated under her organization's direct counsel and coordination. She paused. That absence speaks louder than any testimony we might have heard today. But someone else had come forward. An unassuming man in his late 40s, Joseph Warren, former deputy compliance officer at Power Forward Communities, now under whistleblower protection, took the oath under full congressional immunity. His testimony, would shift the room's temperature by degrees. There was no internal capacity to manage federal funds, Warren said calmly. The organization was formed rapidly, with guidance from external political consultants and lobbyists, not infrastructure experts. Our only goal in 2023 was to secure a piece of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. He detailed how Power Forward received verbal assurance from senior EPA officials months before the formal application process began. He claimed that budget templates were backdated, and that consulting firms linked to Democratic fundraisers ghostwrote portions of their IRS filings. One phrase stood out above the rest. We knew we didn't qualify, but we also knew we were politically untouchable. Caroline Leavitt, seated beside Bondi, watched as the committee introduced a 68-page internal report, the result of a joint investigation between Bondi's office, the House Oversight Committee, and independent grant fraud auditors. The findings were brutal. $310 million allocated to subcontracts, with no verified execution, $58 million labeled under public engagement with no receipts. A $1 million payment to a marketing firm, registered to a PO box in the Cayman Islands. One board member reimbursed $204,000 for travel accommodations and advisory sessions with no log of locations or meeting notes. Multiple payments to accounts flagged by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, as high risk. Bondi took a breath. The words were clear, clinical, but the implication was chaos. This, she said, is not a policy failure. This is financial misconduct cloaked in virtue language. This is what happens when accountability is replaced by identity, when oversight is sacrificed for political favor. Some Democrats began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A few had already quietly signaled to media outlets that they would support a bipartisan resolution for a full federal probe. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Outside, on the Capitol steps, protesters and counter-protesters clashed in chants. One banner read, $100 stow $2 billion, where's our cut? Another replied, Bondi's backroom coup, hands off Abrams. Inside, Bondi pressed on. Let me be perfectly clear, she said, locking eyes with the press section. This isn't about stopping environmental action. This is about stopping corruption. It's about preserving faith in public institutions. You cannot champion justice while institutionalizing fraud. By the end of the day, the House Oversight Committee passed a unanimous vote to forward the findings to the DOJ's Criminal Division. The referral named 6 individuals, including 3 current EPA officials and 2 senior advisors affiliated with Rewiring America. Bondi's office confirmed that the Department of Justice had opened a grand jury review in Washington's Eastern District. The White House, now under enormous pressure, finally issued a direct statement. The president supports accountability and transparency. While we will refrain from commenting on active legal proceedings, we affirm the integrity of our institutions and call on all parties to uphold due process. It was carefully written. It said everything and nothing. By June, the story had transformed the landscape. EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin resigned, citing a need to not distract from ongoing environmental priorities. The Office of Management and Budget instituted a moratorium on all climate grant disbursements pending procedural audit. A Senate bill proposing stricter oversight of discretionary federal grants gained 37 co-sponsors overnight. Stacey Abrams, now silent and legally encumbered, withdrew from multiple board positions and declined further media engagements. Public opinion polls, once supportive, now hovered at net negative favorability for the first time in 5 years. Bondi, in contrast, saw a 17-point surge in national approval among independents. On the last page of the final hearing transcript, Pam Bondi gave closing remarks that would later be framed and hung in the Oversight Committee hallway. This country cannot afford to trade integrity for ideology. No cause, no matter how righteous it may sound, can justify the abandonment of law, logic, or trust. We are stewards of taxpayer dollars, not stewards of political convenience. She closed the folder, stepped down from the dais, and exited to a hallway filled with cameras. But for once, she said nothing. As the summer session of Congress began, the political world buzzed with speculation. Would this scandal rewrite the rules for nonprofit funding? Would new ethics legislation emerge? Or would Washington do what it often does, survive the storm, only to forget. For now, one thing remained certain. Pam Bondi had done what few dared. She lit a match inside the House of Power and watched what had long smoldered finally burn in public view.